Hello and welcome. I'm Jennifer March, and this is not Your Mother's Storytime. This week, more Winesburg, Ohio by Sherwood Anderson, The Strength of God, and The Teacher. Did you know Anderson was self-educated and rose to become a successful copyright and business owner in Cleveland and Elyria, Ohio? He worked for a marketing company that marketed egg incubators. One of the manufacturers he marketed produced a large batch of defective incubators. Soon, letters addressed to Anderson, who personally guaranteed all products sold, began to arrive from customers both desperate and angry. I'm wondering if some of those letters came from Petalumans. The strain from months of answering hundreds of these letters while continuing his demanding schedule at work and home led to a nervous breakdown in the summer of 1907, and eventually his departure from the company. In 1912, Anderson had another nervous breakdown that led him to abandon his business and family to become a writer. Lucky for us. And now, The Strength of God, concerning the Reverend Curtis Hartman. The Reverend Curtis Hartman was pastor of the Presbyterian Church of Winesburg and had been in the position for 10 years. He was 40 years old and, by his nature, very silent and reticent. To preach, standing in the pulpit before the people, was always a hardship for him, and on Wednesday morning until Saturday evening he thought of nothing but the 2 sermons that must be preached on Sunday. Early on Sunday morning he went into a little room called a study in the bell tower of the church and prayed. In his prayers there was one note that always predominated. "Give me strength and courage for thy work, O Lord," he pleaded, kneeling on the bare floor and bowing his head in the presence of the task that lay before him. The Reverend Hartman was a tall man with a brown beard. His wife, a stout, nervous woman, was the daughter of a manufacturer of underwear in Cleveland, Ohio. The minister himself was rather a favorite in the town. The elders of the church liked him because he was quiet and unpretentious, and Mrs. White, the banker's wife, thought him scholarly and refined. The Presbyterian Church held itself somewhat aloof from the other churches of Winesburg. It was larger and more imposing, and its minister was better paid. He even had a carriage of his own, and on summer evenings sometimes drove about town with his wife. Through Main Street and up and down Buckeye Street he went, bowing gravely to the people, while his wife, afire with secret pride, looked at him out of the corner of her eyes, and worried lest the horse become frightened and run away. For a good many years after he came to Winesburg, things went well with Curtis Hartman. He was not one to arouse keen enthusiasm among the worshippers in his church, but on the other hand, he made no enemies. In reality, he was much in earnest, and sometimes suffered prolonged periods of remorse, because he could not go crying the word of God in the highways and byways of the town. He wondered if the flame of the Spirit really burned in him, and dreamed of a day when a strong, sweet, new current of power would come like a great wind into his voice and his soul, and the people would tremble before the Spirit of God made manifest in him. "I am a poor stick, and that will never really happen to me," he mused dejectedly, and then a patient smile lit up his face. "Oh, well, I suppose I'm doing well enough," he added philosophically. The room in the bell tower of the church, where on Sunday mornings the minister prayed for an increase in him in the power of God, had but one window. It was long and narrow and swung outward on a hinge like a door. On the window, made of little leaded panes, was a design showing the Christ laying his hand upon the head of a child. One Sunday morning in the summer, as he sat by his desk in the room with the large Bible open before him, and the sheets of his sermon scattered about, the minister was shocked to see in the upper room of the house next door a woman lying in her bed and smoking a cigarette while she read a book. Curtis Hartman went on tiptoe to the window and closed it softly. He was horror-stricken at the thought of a woman smoking, and trembled also to think that his eyes, just raised from the pages of the Book of God, had looked upon the bare shoulders and white throat of a woman. With his brain in a whirl, he went down into the pulpit and preached a long sermon without once thinking of his gestures or his voice. The sermon attracted unusual attention because of its power and clearness. "I wonder if she's listening, if my voice is carrying a message into her soul," he thought, and began to hope that on future Sunday mornings he might be able to say words that would touch and awaken the woman apparently far gone in secret sin. The house next door to the Presbyterian church, through the windows of which the minister had seen the sight that had so upset him, was occupied by two women. Aunt Elizabeth Swift, a gray, competent-looking widow with money in the Winesburg National Bank, lived there with her daughter Kate Swift, a schoolteacher. The schoolteacher was 30 years old and had a neat, trim-looking figure. She had few friends and bore a reputation of having a sharp tongue. When he began to think about her, Curtis Hartman remembered that she had been to Europe and had lived for 2 years in New York City. Perhaps, after all, her smoking means nothing, he thought. He began to remember that when he was a student in college and occasionally read novels, good, although somewhat worldly women had smoked through the pages of a book that had once fallen into his hands. With a rush of new determination, he worked on his sermons all through the week, and forgot, in his zeal to reach the ears and the soul of this new listener, both his embarrassment in the pulpit and the necessity of prayer in study on Sunday mornings. Reverend Hartman's experience with women had been somewhat limited. He was the son of a wagon maker from Muncie, Indiana, and had worked his way through college. The daughter of the underwear manufacturer had boarded in a house where he lived during his school days, and he had married her after a formal and prolonged courtship, carried on for the most part by the girl herself. On his marriage day, the underwear manufacturer had given his daughter $5,000, and he promised to leave her at least twice that amount in his will. The minister had thought himself fortunate in marriage, and had never permitted himself to think of other women. He did not want to think of other women. What he wanted was to do the work of God, quietly and earnestly. In the soul of the minister a struggle awoke. From wanting to reach the ears of Kate Swift, and through his sermons to delve into her soul, he began to want also to look again at the figure lying white and quiet in the bed. On a Sunday morning, when he could not sleep because of his thoughts, he arose and went to walk in the streets. When he had gone along Main Street, almost to the old Richmond place, he stopped and, picking up a stone, rushed off to the room in the bell tower. With the stone, he broke out a corner of the window, and then locked the door, and sat down at the desk before the open Bible to wait. When the shade of the window to Kate Swift's room was raised, he could see through the hole directly into her bed. But she was not there. She also had arisen and gone for a walk, and the hand that raised the shade was the hand of Aunt Elizabeth Swift. The minister almost wept with joy at this deliverance from the carnal desire to peep, and went back to his own house praising God. In an ill moment he forgot, however, to stop the hole in the window. The piece of broken glass out at the corner of the window just nipped off the bare heel of the boy, standing motionless, and looking with rapt eyes into the face of Christ. Curtis Hartman forgot his sermon on that Sunday morning. He talked to his congregants, and in his talk said that it was a mistake for people to think of their minister as a man set aside and intended by nature to lead a blameless life. Out of my own experience, I know that we, who are the ministers of God's word, are beset by the same temptations that assail you, he declared. I have been tempted and have surrendered to temptation. It is only the hand of God, placed beneath my head, that has raised me up. As he has raised me, also he will raise you. Do not despair. In your hour of sin, raise your eyes to the skies, and you will be again and again saved." Resolutely, the minister put the thoughts of the woman in the bed out of his mind, and began to be something like a lover in the presence of his wife. One evening, when they drove out together, he turned the horse out of Buckeye Street, and in the darkness on Gospel Hill above Waterworks Pond, put his arm around Sarah Hartman's waist. When he had eaten breakfast in the morning and was ready to retire to his study at the back of his house, he ran around the table and kissed his wife on the cheek. When thoughts of Kate Swift came into his head, he smiled and raised his eyes to the skies. "Intercede me, Master," he muttered. "Keep me in the narrow path, intent on thy work." And now began the real struggle in the soul of the brown-bearded minister. By chance, he discovered that Kate Swift was in the habit of lying in her bed in the evenings and reading a book. A lamp stood on a table by the side of the bed, and the light streamed down upon her white shoulders and bare throat. On the evening when he made the discovery, the minister sat at the desk in the dusty room from 9 until after 11, and when her light was put out, stumbled out of the church to spend 2 more hours walking and praying in the streets. He did not want to kiss the shoulders and the throat of Kate Swift, and had not allowed his mind to dwell on such thoughts. He did not know what he wanted. "I am God's child, and he must save me from myself," he cried in the darkness, under the trees, as he wandered in the streets. By a tree he stood and looked at the sky that was covered with hurrying clouds. He began to talk to God immediately and closely. "Please, Father, do not forget me. Give me power to go tomorrow and repair the hole in the window. Lift my eyes again to the skies. Stay with me, thy servant, in his hour of need." Up and down through the silent streets walked the minister, and for days and weeks his soul was troubled. He could not understand the temptation that had come to him, nor could he fathom the reason for its coming. In a way, he began to blame God, saying to himself that he had tried to keep his feet in the true path and had not run about seeking sin. "Through my days as a young man, and all through my life here, I have gone quietly about my work," he declared. "Why now should I be tempted? What have I done that this burden should be laid on me?" 3 times during the early fall and winter of that year, Curtis Hartman crept out of his house to the room in the bell tower to sit in the darkness, looking at the figure of Kate Swift lying in her bed, and later went to walk and pray in the streets. He could not understand himself. For weeks he would go along scarcely thinking of the schoolteacher and telling himself that he had conquered the carnal desire to look at her body. And then something would happen. As he sat in the study of his own house, hard at work on the sermon, he would become nervous and begin to walk up and down the room. "I will go out into the streets," he told himself, and even as he let himself in at the church door, he persistently denied to himself the cause of his being there. "I will not repair the hole in the window, and I will train myself to come here at night and sit in the presence of this woman without raising my eyes. I will not be defeated in this thing. The Lord has devised this temptation as a test of my soul, and I will grope my way out of darkness into the light of righteousness." One night in January, when it was bitter cold and snow lay on the streets of Winesburg, Curtis Hartman paid his last visit to the room in the bell tower of the church. It was past 9 o'clock when he left his own house, and he set out so hurriedly that he forgot to put on his overshoes. In Main Street, no one was abroad but Hop Higgins, the night watchman, and in the whole town no one was awake but the watchman and young George Willard, who sat in the office of the Winesburg Eagle, trying to write a story. Along the street to the church went the minister, plowing through the drifts, and thinking that this time he would utterly give way to sin. "I want to look at the woman, and to think of kissing her shoulders, and I'm going to let myself think what I choose," he declared bitterly, and tears came into his eyes. He began to think that he would get out of the ministry and try some other way of life. "I shall go to some city and get into business," he declared. "If my nature is such that I cannot resist sin, I shall give myself over to sin. At least I shall not be a hypocrite, preaching the word of God with my mind thinking of the shoulders and neck of a woman who does not belong to me." It was cold in the room of the bell tower of the church on that January night, and almost as soon as he came into the room, Curtis Hartman knew that if he stayed, he would be ill. His feet were wet from tramping in the snow, and there was no fire. In the room in the house next door, Kate Swift had not yet appeared. With grim determination, the man sat down to wait. Sitting in the chair and gripping the edge of the desk on which lay the Bible, he stared into the darkness, thinking the blackest thoughts of his life. He thought of his wife, and for a moment almost hated her. "She has always been ashamed of passion, and has cheated me," he thought. "Man has a right to expect living passion and beauty in a woman. He has no right to forget that he is an animal, and in me there is something that is Greek. I will throw off the woman of my bosom and seek other women. I will besiege this school teacher. I will fly in the face of all men, and if I am a creature of carnal lust, I will live then for my lust." The distracted man trembled from head to foot, partly from cold, partly from the struggle in which he was engaged. Hours passed, and a fever assailed his body. His throat began to hurt, and his teeth chattered. His feet on the study floor felt like 2 cakes of ice. Still he would not give up. "I will see this woman, and I will think thoughts I have never dared to think," he told himself, gripping the edge of the desk and waiting. Curtis Hartman came near dying from the effects of that night of waiting in the church, and also he found in the thing that happened what he took to be the way of life for him. On other evenings when he had waited, he had not been able to see, through the little hole in the glass, any part of the schoolteacher's room except that occupied by her bed. In the darkness, he waited until the woman suddenly appeared sitting in her bed in her white nightrobe. When the light was turned up, she propped herself up among the pillows and read a book. Sometimes she smoked one of the cigarettes. Only her bare shoulders and throat were visible. On the January night, after he had come near dying with cold, and after his mind had 2 or 3 times actually slipped away into an odd land of fantasy, so that he had, by an exercise of willpower, to force himself back into consciousness, Kate Swift appeared. In the room next door a lamp was lighted, and the waiting man stared into an empty bed. Then upon the bed before his eyes a naked woman threw herself. Lying face downward, she wept and beat with her fists upon the pillow. With a final outburst of weeping, she half rose, and, in the presence of the man who had waited to look and not to think thoughts of the woman of sin, began to pray. In the lamplight, her figure, slim and strong, looked like the figure of the boy in the presence of Christ on the leaded window. Curtis Hartman never remembered how he got out of the church. With a cry, he arose, dragging the heavy desk along the floor. The Bible fell, making a great clatter in the silence. When the light in the house next door went out, he stumbled down the stairs and into the street. Along the street he went, and ran in at the door of the Winesburg Eagle. To George Willard, who was tramping up and down in the office, undergoing a struggle of his own, he began to talk half incoherently. "The ways of God are beyond human understanding," he cried, running in quickly and closing the door. He began to advance upon the young man, his eyes glowing and his voice ringing with fervor. "I have found the light," he cried. After 10 years in this town, God has manifested himself to me in the body of a woman." His voice dropped, and he began to whisper. "I did not understand," he said. "What I took to be a trial of my soul was only a preparation for a new and more beautiful fervor of the Spirit. God has appeared to me in the person of Kate Swift, the school teacher, kneeling naked on a bed. Do you know Kate Swift? Although she may not be aware of it, she is an instrument of God, bearing the message of truth." Reverend Curtis Hartman turned and ran out of the office. At the door he stopped, and after looking up and down the deserted street, turned again to George Willard. "I am delivered. Have no fear." He held up a bleeding fist for the young man to see. "I smashed the glass of the window," he cried. "Now it will have to be wholly replaced. The strength of God was in me, and I broke it with my fist." The Teacher, concerning Kate Swift. Snow lay deep in the streets of Winesburg. It had begun to snow about 10 o'clock in the morning, and a wind sprang up and blew the snow in clouds along Main Street. The frozen mud roads that led into town were fairly smooth, and in places ice covered the mud. "There will be good sleighing," said Will Henderson, standing by the bar in Ed Griffith's saloon. Out of the saloon he went and met Sylvester West, the druggist, stumbling along in the kind of heavy overshoes called Arctics. "Snow will bring the people into town on Saturday," said the druggist. The two men stopped and discussed their affairs. Will Henderson, who had on a light overcoat and no overshoes, kicked the heel of his left foot with the toe of the right. "Snow will be good for the wheat," observed the druggist sagely. Young George Willard, who had nothing to do, was glad because he didn't feel like working that day. The weekly paper had been printed and taken to the post office Wednesday evening, and the snow began to fall on Thursday. At 8 o'clock, after the morning train had passed, he put a pair of skates in his pocket and went up to Waterworks Pond, but did not go skating. Past the pond and along a path that followed Wine Creek he went, until he came to a grove of beech trees. There he built a fire against the side of a log and sat down at the end of the log to think. When the snow began to fall and the wind to blow, he hurried about, getting fuel for the fire. The young reporter was thinking of Kate Swift, who had once been his schoolteacher. On the evening before, he had gone to her house to get a book she wanted him to read, and had been alone with her for an hour. For the 4th or 5th time, the woman had talked to him with great earnestness, and he could not make out what she meant by her talk. He began to believe she must be in love with him, and the thought was both pleasing and annoying. Up from the log he sprang and began to pile sticks on the fire. Looking about to be sure he was alone, he talked aloud, pretending he was in the presence of the woman. "Oh, you're just letting on. You know you are," he declared. "I'm going to find out about you. You wait and see." The young man got up and went back along the path toward town, leaving the fire blazing in the wood. As he went through the streets, the skates clanked in his pocket. In his own room in the new Willard house, he built a fire in the stove and laid down on top of the bed. He began to have lustful thoughts, and pulling down the shade of the window, closed his eyes and turned his face to the wall. He took the pillow into his arms and embraced it, thinking first of the schoolteacher, who by her words had stirred something within him, and later of Helen White, the slim daughter of the town banker, with whom he had been for a long time half in love. By 9 o'clock that evening, snow lay deep in the streets, and the weather had become bitter cold. It was difficult to walk about. The stores were dark, and the people had crawled away into their houses. The evening train from Cleveland was very late, but nobody was interested in its arrival. By 10 o'clock, all but 4 of the 1,800 citizens of the town were in bed. Hop Higgins, the night watchman, was partially awake. He was lame and carried a heavy stick. On dark nights he carried a lantern. Between 9 and 10 o'clock he went his rounds. Up and down Main Street he stumbled through the drifts, trying the doors of the stores. Then he went into the alleyways and tried the back doors. Finding all tight, he hurried around the corner to the Willard house and beat on the door. Through the rest of the night he intended to stay by the stove. "You go to bed. I'll keep the stove going," he said to the boy, who slept on a cot in the hotel office. Hop Higgins sat down by the stove and took off his shoes. When the boy had gone to sleep, he began to think of his own affairs. He intended to paint his house in the spring, and sat by the stove calculating the cost of paint and labor. That led him into other calculations. The night watchman was 60 years old and wanted to retire. He had been a soldier in the Civil War and drew a small pension. He hoped to find some new method of making a living and aspired to become a professional breeder of ferrets. Already he had 4 of the strangely shaped, savage little creatures that are used by sportsmen in the pursuit of rabbits in the cellar of his house. "Now I have 1 male and 3 females," he mused. "If I'm lucky, by spring I shall have 12 or 15. In another year, I shall be able to begin advertising ferrets for sale in the sporting papers." The night watchman settled into his chair, and his mind became a blank. He did not sleep. By years of practice, he had trained himself to sit for hours through the long nights, neither asleep nor awake. In the morning, he was almost as refreshed as though he had slept. With Hop Higgins safely stowed away in the chair behind the stove, only 3 people were awake in Winesburg. George Willard was in the office of the Eagle, pretending to be at work on the writing of a story, but in reality, continuing the mood of the morning by the fire in the wood. In the bell tower of the Presbyterian Church, the Reverend Curtis Hartman was sitting in the darkness, preparing himself for a revelation from God. And Kate Swift, the schoolteacher, was leaving her house for a walk in the storm. It was past 10 o'clock when Kate Swift set out, and the walk was unpremeditated. It was as though the man and the boy, by thinking of her, had driven her forth into the wintry streets. Aunt Elizabeth Swift had gone to the country seat concerning some business in connection with mortgages, in which she had money invested, and would not be back until the next day. By a huge stove, called a base burner, in the living room of the house, sat the daughter reading a book. Suddenly she sprang to her feet, and snatching a cloak from a rack by the front door, ran out of the house. At the age of 30, Kate Swift was not known in Winesburg as a pretty woman. Her complexion was not good, and her face was covered with blotches that indicated ill health. Alone in the night in the winter streets, she was lovely. Her back was straight, her shoulders square, and her features were as the features of a tiny goddess on a pedestal in a garden in the dim light of a summer evening. During the afternoon, the schoolteacher had been to see Dr. Welling concerning her health. The doctor had scolded her and had declared that she was in danger of losing her hearing. It was foolish for Kate Swift to be abroad in the storm. Foolish and perhaps dangerous. The woman in the streets did not remember the words of the doctor, and would not have turned back had she remembered. She was very cold, but after walking for 5 minutes no longer minded the cold. First, she went to the end of her own street, and then across a pair of hay scales set in the ground before a feed barn, and into Trunnion Pike. Along Trunnion Pike, she went to Ned Winter's barn, and turning east followed a street of low frame houses that led over Gospel Hill and into Sucker Road, that ran down a shallow valley past Ike Smead's chicken farm to Waterworks Pond. As she went along, the bold, excited mood that had driven her out of doors passed, and then returned again. There was something biting and forbidding in the character of Kate Swift. Everyone felt it. In the classroom she was silent, cold, and stern, and yet in an odd way, very close to her pupils. Once in a long while something seemed to have come over her, and she was happy. All of the children in the schoolroom felt the effect of her happiness. For a time they did not work, but sat back in their chairs and looked at her. With hands clasped behind her back, the schoolteacher walked up and down in the classroom, and talked very rapidly. It did not seem to matter what subject came into her mind. Once she talked to the children of Charles Lamb and made up strange, intimate little stories concerning the life of the dead writer. The stories were told with an air of one who had lived in a house with George Lamb and knew all the secrets of his private life. The children were somewhat confused, thinking Charles Lamb must be someone who once lived in Winesburg. On another occasion, the teacher talked to the children of Benvenuto Cellini. That time, they laughed. What a bragging, blustering, brave, lovable fellow she made of the old artist. Concerning him also, she invented anecdotes. There was one of a German music teacher who had a room above Cellini's lodging in the city of Milan that had the boys guffaw. Sugars McNuts, a fat boy with red cheeks, laughed so hard that he became dizzy and fell off his seat, and Kate Swift laughed with him. Then, suddenly, she became again cold and stern. On the winter night when she walked through the deserted, snow-covered streets, a crisis had come into the life of the schoolteacher. Although no one in Winesburg would have suspected it, her life had been very adventurous. It was still adventurous. Day by day, as she worked in the schoolroom or walked in the streets, grief, hope, and desire fought within her. Behind a cold exterior, the most extraordinary events transpired in her mind. The people of the town thought of her as a confirmed old maid, and because she spoke sharply and went her own way, thought her lacking in all the human feeling that did so much to make and mar their own lives. In reality, she was the most eagerly passionate soul among them, and more than once, in the 5 years since she had come back from her travels to settle in Winesburg and become a schoolteacher, had been compelled to go out of the house and walk half through the night, fighting out some battle raging within. Once, on a night when it rained, she had stayed out 6 hours, and when she came home had a quarrel with Aunt Elizabeth Swift. "I'm glad you're not a man," said her mother sharply. "More than once I've waited for your father to come home, not knowing what new mess he'd gotten into. I've had my share of uncertainty, and you cannot blame me if I do not want to see the worst side of him produced in you." Kate Swift's mind was ablaze with thoughts of George Willard. In something he had written as a schoolboy, she thought she had recognized the spark of genius and wanted to blow on the spark. One day in the summer she had gone to the Eagle office and, finding the boy unoccupied, had taken him out to Main Street to the fairgrounds, where the two sat on a grassy bank and talked. The schoolteacher tried to bring to the mind of the boy some conception of the difficulties he would have to face as a writer. "You will have to know life," she declared, and her voice trembled with earnestness. She took hold of George Willard's shoulders and turned him about so that she could look into his eyes. A passer-by might have thought them about to embrace. "If you are to become a writer, you'll have to stop fooling with words," she explained. "It would be better to give up the notion of writing until you are better prepared. Now it's time to be living. I don't want to frighten you, but I would like to make you understand the import of what you think of attempting. You must not become a mere peddler of words. The thing to learn is to know what people are thinking about, not what they say." On the evening before that stormy Thursday night, when the Reverend Curtis Hartman sat in the bell tower of the church waiting to look at her body, young Willard had gone to visit the teacher and to borrow a book. It was then the thing happened that confused and puzzled the boy. He had the book under his arm and was preparing to depart. Again, Kate Swift talked with great earnestness. Night was coming on, and the light in the room grew dim. As he turned to go, she spoke his name softly, and with an impulsive movement took hold of his hand. Because the reporter was rapidly becoming a man, something of his man's appeal, combined with the winsomeness of the boy, stirred the heart of the lonely woman. A passionate desire to have him understand the import of life, to learn to interpret it truly and honestly, swept over her. Leaning forward, her lips brushed his cheek. At the same moment, He, for the first time, became aware of the marked beauty of her features. They were both embarrassed, and to relieve her feelings, she became harsh and domineering. "What's the use? It will be 10 years before you begin to understand what I mean when I talk to you," she cried passionately. On the night of the storm, and while the minister sat in the church waiting for her, Kate Swift went to the office of the Winesburg Eagle, intending to have another talk with the boy. After the long walk in the snow, she was cold, lonely, and tired. As she came through Main Street, she saw the light from the print shop window shining on the snow, and on an impulse opened the door and went in. For an hour she sat by the stove in the office talking of life. She talked with passionate earnestness. The impulse that had driven her out into the snow poured itself out into talk. She became inspired, as she sometimes did in the presence of the schoolchildren, a great earnestness to open the door of life to the boy, who had been her pupil, and who she thought might possess a talent for the understanding of life, had possession of her. So strong was her passion that it became something physical. Again her hands took hold of his shoulders, and she turned him about. In the dim light her eyes blazed. She arose and laughed, not sharply as was customary with her, but in a queer, hesitating way. "I must be going," she said. "In a moment, if I stay, I'll be wanting to kiss you." In the newspaper office, a confusion arose. Kate Swift turned and walked out the door. She was a teacher, but she was also a woman. As she looked at George Willard, the passionate desire to be loved by a man that had 1,000 times before swept like a storm over her body took possession of her. In the lamplight, George Willard looked no longer a boy, but a man, ready to play the part of a man. The schoolteacher let George Willard take her into his arms. In the warm little office, the air became suddenly heavy, and the strength went out of her body. Leaning against a low counter by the door, she waited. When he came and put a hand on her shoulder, she turned and let her body fall heavily against him. For George Willard, the confusion was immediately increased. For a moment, he held the body of the woman tightly against his body, and then it stiffened. 2 sharp little fists began beating on his face. When the schoolteacher had run away and left him alone, he walked up and down the office, swearing furiously. It was into this confusion that Reverend Curtis Hartman protruded himself. When he came in, George Willard thought the town had gone mad. Shaking a bleeding fist in the air, the minister proclaimed the woman George had only a moment before held in his arms as an instrument of God bearing a message of truth. George blew out the lamp by the window and, locking the door of the print shop, went home. Through the hotel office, past Hop Higgins, lost in his dreams of the raising of ferrets, he went up and into his own room. The fire in the stove had gone out, and he undressed in the cold. When he got into bed, the sheets were like blankets of dry snow. George Willard rolled about in the bed on which he had lain in the afternoon, hugging the pillow and thinking thoughts of Kate Swift. The words of the minister, who he thought had gone suddenly insane, rang in his ears. His eyes stared about the room. The resentment, natural to the baffled male, passed, and he tried to understand what had happened. He could not make it out. Over and over he turned the matter in his mind. Hours passed, and he began to think it must be time for another day to come. At 4 o'clock, he pulled the covers up about his neck and tried to sleep. When he became drowsy and closed his eyes, he raised a hand, and with it groped about in the darkness. I have missed something. I have missed something Kate Swift was trying to tell me," he muttered sleepily. Then he slept, and in all Winesburg he was the last soul on that winter night to go to sleep. And those are our stories for this evening. I hope you enjoyed The Strength of God and The Teacher. from Winesburg, Ohio, by Sherwood Anderson. Thank you for listening. I'm Jennifer March, and this is not your mother's story time.